What does that mean?
The same place where you hit gallery view. If you hit the button that says speaker view.
Oh, I see.
Eliza! Hi!
Hello.
Ah, wonderful, wonderful. All right. So it's 8:05. Should we get started?
I think we should get started.
All right,
People
cool.
might trickle in, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's super okay. So hello, everybody, and welcome to Talk Flock 2. I'm Jerry.
And I'm Anna. So every 2 weeks or so, we're inviting two friends from different fields to give a brief and brilliant talk online on topics of their choosing.
These talks can be scripted or unscripted.
Lecture or performance.
About anything or nothing at all.
Through it all, we're looking at how people and ideas can meet in this digital non-space we find ourselves in.
And seek new possibilities within that non-space for encounter, wonder, serendipity, and engagement.
Tonight, our talkers are Tonita Cervantes and Darrius Ruffian, and they'll each deliver 20-minute talks.
After which we will open up this digital floor for Q&A and discussion.
And we do hope that the discussion gets lively. This is your digital space as much as it is ours.
So we'll listen, we'll talk, maybe we'll disagree a bit, maybe we'll figure some things out.
Maybe spiral into deep, productive confusion together.
Fingers crossed.
So as we begin, I know that we are gathered from many different places, but I would like to acknowledge that Jerry and I are speaking to you from the unceded land of the Lenape people, and this Zoom application is coming to you from the unceded land of the Tamayan peoples. Can we all take a breath together to offer acknowledgement and deep gratitude to these people and this land? We would not be here today without the genocide and systematic exclusion of indigenous peoples. So let's take a breath.
Oh.
Thank you. This acknowledgement is just a first step towards a lifelong fight to dismantle the legacy of settler colonialism and white supremacy. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Anna. So a couple of points of Zoom ticket I'd like to make before we begin. That is a portmanteau of Zoom and etiquette, of course. So first, please keep yourself muted during the talks and discussion portion unless you yourself are talking. Even a little bit of background noise can mess up the sound for everybody. So right now is a very good time to go to the lower left corner of your screen and click that mute button. Second, video is optional. It's really lovely to see all of your lovely faces, but absolutely no pressure to be on camera. You do whatever you need to do, my friends. Third, we will be recording tonight's session for archival purposes. So please feel free to turn off your video if that makes you uncomfortable. And feel free to reach out to me or Anna if you'd rather not this video be posted online for any reason at all. And fourth, this is the chat box. We invite discussion there as well as over the microphone, so feel free to use it as you see fit. That just about does it. So Anna, I think we're ready to get started. Why don't you introduce our first talker?
Okay. Our first talker tonight is Darrius Ruffian, who I have known since I was 12 years old, right? Or maybe 13. I have seen him through many hilarious phases, including a little bit of goth, at least like a healthy Bright Eyes obsession. I think that continues to this day. Actually, a hilarious anecdote is I think the first time we became friends is after Darius in middle school called me a pretentious bitch. He fell out of a tree.
That did happen.
And that sort of cemented the relationship. And since then, I've seen him grow in so many fantastical ways. And now he is a really accomplished and talented radio producer on The Indicator, NPR's The Indicator, which is a part of Planet Money. And he'll tell you more about that. So he's going to illuminate some really interesting history for us. Thank you, Darius.
Thank you so much, Anna. And yes, Anna has definitely bared with me through some of my most insufferable phases, including my Ayn Rand phase, and has done a lot to teach me how to be a better person. So a little bit background on me, mostly because I think it's important for what I want to talk about tonight. I am a reporter and producer for a show at NPR called The Indicator. It's part of the Planet Money team, and what we do on the Planet Money team is we tell stories about money and markets and the economy, but really we tell story about people and about the human parts of the economy, about human behavior, and about how all of those other things, markets and money, impact people. And we try to kind of keep it light. We try to keep sight of humor and humility in talking about the economy, and above all, to not be boring. And the reason I mention this is because sometimes I feel a little bit like I straddle two worlds. I have one foot in a world at work where I'm surrounded by people who are big fans of capitalism, who to them it's not a dirty word, you know, and it's synonymous with them, for them to property rights and efficient markets and freedom of choice. And then outside of work, I'm sort of, when I'm with my peers, that's sort of a world where capitalism is a very dirty word, and it's synonymous with, you know, exploitation and institutionalized suffering and, you know, utter unsustainability. I think that there is valid truth to both these points of view. And I guess let me say here, I'm going to talk about capitalism today, so I'm probably going to piss off everybody. But please feel free to let me know all the things I'm wrong about. That's how I learn. But yeah, so I sometimes feel like I straddle two worlds. My coworkers think I'm a radical leftist, and my friends think I'm a neoliberal shill. But this has sort of pushed me to really think long and hard about how I do feel about capitalism. You know, and for all intents and purposes, when I talk about capitalism, which is a word that means a lot of things to a lot of people, I'm sort of talking about, you know, a system of, you know, wage labor, private property rights, market exchange, all denominated in money, with economic growth as the systemic imperative of it all. But yeah, so I've had to think long and hard about what I think about capitalism, and I've sort of come to the conclusion that I think clearly we're living in an economic system with a lot of injustice built into it. But to just say capitalism is bad is sort of inadequate, mostly because there isn't a big capitalism switch that we can just turn off and there'll be no more capitalism. What we call capitalism is sort of made up of lots of different institutions, each with their own incentive structures and each with their own sort of problems to be dealt with. So I guess today I want to talk about a few of those institutions, and this talk will be by no means exhaustive, but basically where this all started for me was I was thinking about the fact that when we critique capitalism in the 21st century, very often that's synonymous with a critique of finance and banking. The two are oftentimes just inextricably linked. But I realized something that kind of changed my whole way of looking at things, which is that finance predates capitalism by about 5,000 years. We see the emergence of finance with the first cities in early Mesopotamia. I mean, if you look at early Mesopotamian writing, early cuneiform tablets, which is the earliest writing we have, you know, dating back 4,000 or 5,000 years, the vast majority of it is financial documents. You know, it's mortgages and deeds and loans and futures contracts for hedging against shifts in commodity prices, and letters of credit and insurance contracts and all this stuff. And it's also quite complex. I mean, the average person 5,000 years ago would have had a really good understanding of compound interest. They would have had a really good understanding of the time value of money and ideas such as collateral. I mean, basically all of the fundamental building blocks of our modern financial system were already humming along, you know, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. And basically what we see is that it emerges with the emergence of agriculture. And some scholars would argue civilization would not have even been possible without development of some kind of financial technology. Because, once you start living in an agricultural society, you need, well, actually, I should take a step back here. I mean, what is finance? And this is going to be the center of kind of everything that I'm talking about. Matt Levine, who's a columnist with Bloomberg, has a really great thing that he says, which is finance is time travel. Finance is the ability to take value from the future and bring it to the present, as is the case if you take out a loan to start a small business, for example. Or it's the ability to take value from the present and transport it into the future, which is the case with a retirement account or an annuity. And the reason that we as a civilization start to need that technology is because once you're dealing not with a hunter-gatherer society, but with an agricultural society, you have a farmer who needs resources to plant his crops now for returns that won't materialize until harvest time. And you need the ability to hedge against the risk that you might have a bad crop. And maybe the biggest thing, if you're living in a band of hunter-gatherers of maybe 100 or 150 people, you guys can lend things to each other. And the system of just reciprocal knowing each other and being accountable to one another can be all the enforcement you need for lending things to each other. You can share things. You have sort of a shared community that ties you all together. Once you start talking about cities of 20 or 30 or 40,000 people, you kind of need something that will allow complete strangers to coordinate and to speak a common language. And this is when we see the emergence of, money, which is sort of universally accepted, or financial contracts controlling who owes what to who, that can be understood by everyone in a city of 50,000 people. Another way that finance props up the creation of civilization is that it makes trade possible, because the earliest financiers, a big part of what they did was essentially offer insurance for people who are taking risks by sailing a boat across the ocean to bring goods from somewhere else. And this is what allowed a civilization like Mesopotamia, which was rich in grain, but very poor in other resources, to grow to be massive. They needed to bring resources from somewhere else. Or a civilization like, ancient Athens, which was rich in silver, but very poor in grain and needed to import it from the Black Sea. So we see all these ways that sort of finance developed in parallel with civilization and in some ways made civilization possible. Now, I'm not going to weigh in on whether civilization is a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe moving to an agricultural society was our original fall from grace, and it's all been downhill from there. My point is sort of that you can't separate the two, and anything you like about civilization also came from finance, and anything you hate about civilization probably also came from finance. But I want to dig a little deeper into what that finance sort of looked like in ancient Mesopotamia. And I'm relying here on the work of a scholar named Mark Van de Meerup. I'm probably totally mispronouncing that. But he's at Columbia, and he's done a lot of work studying the archaeology of ancient Ur, which is the birthplace of Abraham and also the birthplace of finance. And he's basically uncovered that there was a financial district in ancient Ur where all of the sort of financiers set up shop and gave loans and offered insurance and did all of what we would think of sort of bankers and financiers doing today. And Professor Van de Meerup focuses specifically on one particular financier that I think is it's very interesting to look at, which is a man named Dumuzi Gamil. And we have all of his financial records. So we have an idea of what his business looked like. And it essentially consisted of borrowing silver from very rich people and paying back at low interest, and then issuing loans to other people at higher interest and pocketing the difference. And we know that Dumuzi Gamil, he bankrolled the massive public bakeries that the government of ancient Mesopotamia used to feed all of the citizens. And he also gave loans to farmers and fishermen to help them get through bad times. And the thing that I find very interesting is that there was even, you could loan money to someone in exchange for a clay tablet that says, I'm going to pay you back. And then you could sell that clay tablet to another financier, essentially creating the earliest example of securitization. I mean, it's not so different from the asset-backed securities that got us in so much trouble in 2008. Another interesting thing about Dumuzi-Gamil is his business was wiped out in 1788 BCE when there was a terrible financial crisis in and the king issued an edict forgiving everybody's debts, which this shows us that even financial regulation predates capitalism by about 4,000 years. This is all to say that finance is essentially a tool that we've developed, and it's neither evil or good. So that's one way of looking at it, instead of a tool. Another way of looking at it is that it's a collective myth that we've developed to allow coordination and organization across giant groups of people. And when you move to something like banking, which is not quite as old as finance, but similarly, I mean, there's a bank currently operating in Siena, Italy, Banca Monte dei Paschi, which was founded in 1472. And if we think of capitalism as emerging in the 1700s, I mean, that bank predates capitalism by about 300 years. And you can go back even further to ancient Athens, where, again, there was a literal financial district in the port of Athens where bankers set up shop and, wrote loans and issued insurance and took deposits and offered interest and all of that. Actually, the earliest bankers that we know of in Athens were these two men named, again, I'm going to butcher this, Antisthenes and Archistratos. A really interesting fact about their bank is that in 394 BCE, they actually passed the bank down to one of their freed slaves who was named Passio. So I love this detail because it means that a formerly enslaved person owned a bank in 394 BCE, 2,000 years before the emergence of capitalism. So it's, truly something that's been with us for a long time. But I mean, Athens is an interesting example. There's a professor at University College London, his name is Hans van Wees, who has studied the development of sort of ancient Athens. And he argues that it was finance and the financial technology of Athens that actually made democracy possible. Solon, who is a great reformer and was kind of known as the father of Athenian democracy, could have sort of transitioned to democracy first with a giant mortgage forgiveness program, which created this more egalitarian society. And you had a world where we saw the introduction of coins and money, and suddenly you had all the citizens of Athens being able to go all over the world and exchange a coin that has a picture of their patron goddess Athena for goods of all kinds. That sort of solidifies this national identity or this Athenian identity. And furthermore, in a very practical way, the creation of a monetized society in Athens meant that disputes were now settled in courts which were staffed by, and juries which were made up of Athenian citizens chosen at random and paid for their time by the government. So that essentially has led historians to believe that almost every citizen of Athens would have had a turn helping to run these courts and sitting on juries. Almost every citizen of Athens would have been financially literate, and almost every citizen of Athens would have had an understanding of the economic relationship between themselves and the government. Wars were financed by taxing the people, and public works projects were financed that way as well. So, the scholars have argued that this is sort of what gave rise to this new type of this new way of organizing a society, where made up of individuals who have an economic relationship to a government. And I mean, financial technology was also a huge part of the way Athens was able to defend its fledgling democracy from hostile powers. I mean, we think of the famous Parthenon at the top of the Acropolis in Athens as this symbol of ancient Greek culture, but it was literally a treasury. I mean, it's where they kept a massive stockpile of silver. And it was the ability to quickly raise and deploy capital using financial markets that allowed them to raise a fleet to fend off the Persians, as an example. Now, I don't want to get too sort of wide-eyed about finance, because finance also, securitization of enslaved people is what allowed for transatlantic chattel slavery, and financial mechanisms were built into the DNA of imperialism, European imperialism. And I don't think any of us have to really think long about, to come up with an example of financial technology being used for, let's say, less than socially utile ends. But this kind of just, for me, illustrates this point that gets me into a lot of fights with my coworkers who are, who believe deeply that markets and that markets are the right way to organize and deploy resources. And I guess my issue that I have with them is that there's all these institutions within capitalism, within modern capitalism, property rights, markets, monetary exchange, that are sort of held up as fundamentally ethically and morally good and ends in and of themselves. Whereas I think that the right way to think about them is simply tools or useful collective myths that, we can use to achieve ends. I mean, even Adam Smith, Mr. Invisible Hand himself, when he wrote his, seminal works, explicitly articulated that the point of an economy was to provide, good quality of life to people, and not to provide economic growth forever. I mean, this is sort of something that I think that a lot of economists and policymakers have lost sight of, that, it's not economic growth in and of itself. It's not free markets as an end in and of itself. It's what can those tools do to achieve our goals. And the goals are something that it's not easy to articulate, that need to be figured out. There's a scholar at the New School named Nancy Fraser, and she's done a lot of really great work on, what socialism should look like in the 21st century. And she talks about how there should be no markets at the bottom and no markets at the top, but there's room for markets in the in-between. And what does she mean by that? Well, she means that at the bottom, there should be no markets for, healthcare, education, housing. Those should not be left up to markets. At the top, when we're talking about large societal goals of what should we do with the surplus we create, should we even be creating a surplus, those similarly should not be left up to markets. But there's a lot of room in the in-between, in sort of between the bottom and the top. And I have a story that I think illustrates what I mean by this, and what I like about markets. Is actually an episode of Planet Money done, before I started working there, but it was done by Stacey Vanek Smith and Jacob Goldstein. It's called The Pickle Problem. You can look it up. It's great. But it was essentially about a national network of food banks, Feeding America. And they had lots of food that they needed to distribute to food banks all around the country. And so there was a central kind of authority that was deciding what should go where. And you ended up with a lot of really allocatively inefficient outcomes, where people in Idaho were getting potatoes and people in Florida were getting oranges. And so they tried to come up with a better system. And essentially what they did was they issued every food bank in America credits of a fake currency. And they allowed them to bid on a sort of eBay-style auction on which food they wanted. And this created a situation where if someone really needed, potatoes, they would pay more for them, in, say, Florida, and people in Idaho would pay more of this fake currency for oranges. And it created better outcomes in terms of, the allocation of the resources that they had. Even there was one prominent socialist who ran a food bank who was a huge proponent of this program. But it illustrates what I like about markets, and something that economists call the local knowledge problem, which is that some central authority, whoever they are, is never going to have as much information about, what someone in Alaska needs and what resources that person in Alaska has at their disposal than that person themselves. They're all people, individuals and individual institutions are ultimately a pretty good source on what they want and need. So markets can be a very efficient way to express those sort of preferences. But again, this was a situation where there was no market at the bottom because anyone could walk into a food bank and get food for free. So there was no market mechanism in that sense. And there was no market at the top in the sense that Feeding America wasn't relying on markets to procure all of these resources. But markets were an interesting tool for allocating them. So, there's a lot of work that's been done on how we take finance and banking into the 21st century and how we use them as tools for social utility. I don't have the time to get into all that. I would recommend J.W. Mason has an amazing piece in Jacobin called Socializing Finance. People have suggested things like giving control of banks over to they've suggested things of taking more of the functions of finance, such as savings accounts, giving loans to small businesses, credit ratings, these sorts of things, and moving them to the public sector so that they can be democratized in theory and can be aimed towards goals that we all believe in, that we decide collectively are valuable and socially utile. So big picture, I guess, big takeaway, I'm running out of time here, but it's, finance, banking, the technologies of these disciplines and these arts really have been with us since the beginning of time. And to me, the question is not how to get rid of them, but the question is how to use them in a way that makes life better for as many people as possible. So yeah, that's what I have to say.
Let's give it up for Darius. Thank you for that. That was awesome. That was awesome. Look forward to talking about it more soon. But first, we have dear Tonita Cervantes is going to give a talk. And Tonita, I met back in January in New Hampshire at the McDowell Colony. And Tonita had this air about her. I had just arrived when she had already been there for something like 6 weeks. And so she had this air about her of like, ugh, is that all there is? Very just kind of above it. And she even told me to my face that I slipped in just under the wire of the point when she would stop trying to make any friends. Which was, I was honored to have slipped under that wire because she's a really wonderful person. She also is a fierce hiker. When we would go hiking, I stop a lot, and I really like to look at mosses and birds and things up close, and I walk very slowly on hikes. And I recall being with a small group of stoppers, and Tonita had trailed ahead of us like a bullet train, gotten to the end of the hike, and met us back when we were still maybe, I don't know, a third of the way in. And this is sort of, I think, how Tonita's mind works. She's just way ahead of us on everything. And so I'm very excited that she's going to be sharing some of her work with us. She's an activist. She's a photographer. She's a documentarian. She's lived a very interesting life. And I'm excited she's going to share some of it with us now. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Tonita Cervantes.
Okay, can you hear me now? You can? Okay. So thank you for that introduction. Really? Okay. All right. I'm thinking about McDowell. All right. So a lot of this is kind of autobiographical. And in the beginning, it's stuff about my childhood, but it's going to lead somewhere, I promise. So traditionally, a Native American introduces themselves in relationship to the names of their parents and grandparents, tribes and reservations they're from. But I don't have that umbilical cord connection, so I'll simply introduce myself as Tonita Cervantes. I'm Native American, and I'm from San Francisco. So we always begin the greeting with Mitakuye Oyasin, and in Lakota that means to all my relatives. It describes our relationship to all living creation, including plants and animals. And this is a belief, this belief is a spiritual foundation of our Native American culture. So to begin with, I will ask you to please take a moment to think about where you are sitting, and remember that wherever you go in Central, South, and North America, you are walking on red land that was stolen and desecrated by European settlers. And in particular, I am standing in California on Ohlone, Miwok, and Pomo land. And when I sleep and walk in the Sierra Nevadas, I am standing on Ahwahnee land. And thank you for doing that introduction, Anna, in the beginning. So Jerry gave me no boundaries. He said it's fine if I just want to share baby pictures, do a performance piece, or share whatever interests me. And it got me thinking, well, why not start with my baby picture? Because it illustrates why I've always felt so different. And it's the first step in connecting the dots of my life with the current revolution that is unfolding before our eyes. So this is a picture of my brother and me. You can see we look different. It was the beginning of me hating to have my picture taken. It's ironic because I'm a social documentary photographer. For me, photography is a moving meditation in my connection to nature and the spirit world. So the camera lens is a passage to the soul of a person's heart. So as a child, I was always the exotic one. Little Henry, my brother, was the all-American one with the blue eyes. Allegedly, I took after the Cherokee side of my mom's family, and my brother took after his father's European side. So we bought the story and found out much later that this was only one of the many, many elaborate lies and secrets that my mother told to hide the truth about her own horrific childhood in Alabama. So the thing is, I never knew my relatives. I never knew their names. I never knew how many there were. I never knew if my mother had siblings, parents, or cousins. I never knew anything about her, including her real name. So later I discovered I was a result of a New Year's Eve shag and the product of an extramarital affair that she had with an indigenous Mexican man. I guess she was way ahead of her time, but at that time in 1951, it wasn't exactly something you'd brag about. But it may explain why I called my mother's husband Big Henry instead of Dad. But being a part-time Indian was an anomaly in so many ways. I didn't fit in with the native culture. I didn't grow up on the res. I had no idea what being an Indian was. I only know that people viewed me as different. My nicknames were Squaw and Indian, so I grew up feeling like I was living in an alien land with people who were members of the John Birch Society and clearly despised Negroes, Mexicans, Jews, and brown people. Well, as you can imagine, my mother's marriage didn't last. She left Big Henry after she met Fred Hewitt, my adoptive father, at the bar at the Disneyland Hotel, and she married husband number 4. We moved to Newport Beach when I was in the 2nd grade. Boats lined the docks of the yacht club where all the people were white. Instinctively, I kind of knew these weren't exactly my people. This next part of the presentation I never speak about. Many people who've known me for decades still don't know this about me, and you can tell by some of the newspaper clippings that they've probably been in a bag or a drawer for 50 years, which they have. And I'm only sharing this with you as a means of showing you to what drove me to become a political and social activist and photographer. So Newport Beach is surrounded by water. It's a place I became a competitive swimmer. Next picture. I loved the water and was very fast. The Daily Pilot, in fact, anointed me Madam Butterfly and the Lido Flash. So in Los Angeles in August 1968, I placed 3rd in the 100-meter butterfly and 1st in the 200-meter butterfly, earning a spot as a member of the USA Olympic swimming team. So I went to Mexico City Games as a world record holder and was heavily favored by Sports Illustrated to win gold in the 200. But when I got to Mexico, I was dazzled and completely by the colorful costumes and the people of different colors. It absolutely took my breath away. And I finally felt like I was around people that I could relate to. I truly believed at that time that the Olympic experience would be kumbaya, peace, understanding, because the Olympics weren't political, right? Wrong. In high school, I read many books like The Invisible Man, Black Like Me. My hero was Ray Charles. I loved UCLA basketball. And when I got to Mexico, I hung out with Ronaldo Brown. He was an American high jumper. And I also palled around the village with Edwin Anthony Roberts, a black track star from Trinidad and Tobago. So swimming was scheduled for the second half of the Olympics. Track and field was first. Well, as most of you know, from the iconic photograph taken of Tommy Smith and John Carlos on the award stand for the 200-meter sprint, an international incident occurred. Their Black Power fist salute resulted in them being manhandled like criminals and thrown out of the Olympic Village. I was standing there watching when they were evicted. They were not allowed to compete in their other events. because Smith and Carlos had done the unthinkable. They had unmasked racial inequality in America on the world stage, and this was something the authorities weren't about to have. So these events in Mexico were preceded by the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy. It followed the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, as well as the massacre of students in Mexico City who were protesting the corruption of their government and the use of public money to fund the Olympics. The war in Vietnam was raging. Anti-Vietnam War protesters were at home, were challenging the US government's involvement in an illegal war. The Black Panther Party was emerging as an imminent threat against the status quo. Long-haired hippies were openly smoking pot and relishing in the sexual revolution. It was the beginning of the feminist movement, the American Indian movement, the farm workers movement, the LGBT movement, and the continuation of the civil rights movement. The voices of the oppressed demanded to be heard. Women were burning their bras, and young men were burning their draft cards. America was freaked out at the multicultural revolution, challenging the mythology of the American dream. It was sex, drugs, rock and roll. We were tuning in, turning on, and dropping out. Following the protest by Smith and Carlos, my friendship with Edwin Anthony Roberts from Trinidad, Tobago came under intense scrutiny. My mother was summoned to a secret meeting with the coaches and the managers to discuss the possibilities of eliminating me from the swim team and denying me my right to compete in the events that I had qualified for. I had spent 8 years of my life training for the Olympics. In my naivete, I thought the Olympics were a symbol of peace. I was incredibly bewildered. I felt betrayed by the reaction from my team coaches. I went to the Olympics favored to win gold in the 200 meters and was only able to place fourth. I never felt so alone in my life. I felt like I didn't have a friend in the world. And for years, I viewed my loss as a failure and something to be ashamed of. Years later, I was able to see that under the circumstances, I did amazingly well, and that the shame was not mine, but theirs. But for 50 years, I wondered why. Why did they care so much about my friendship with Edwin and not Ronaldo? And it wasn't until 2 months ago when the Australian writer Harry Bluestein called me for an interview that I was able to connect the dots. Harry is researching a book on the politicization of the 1968 Games. He reminded me that Edwin Anthony Roberts had placed fourth right behind Tommy Smith and John Carlos in the 200-meter sprint. Edwin was apparently asked to participate in the demonstrations, and it appears that my white chaperones were terrified I'd be influenced to follow in the steps of Smith and Carlos and embarrass the swim team, my family, and my country. Well, I didn't then, but I have done my level best to make up for that ever since. And when I think about the iconic and historical photograph of Smith and Carlos, and then I think of Colin Kaepernick taking a knee 50 years later, I have to ask this country, are we really all created equal, and what has really changed? So there is an ancient Lakota prophecy that foretells the coming of a black snake. It will burrow underground, desecrate sacred burial lands, and poison the first medicine of the original Turtle Island people, and that's the water. In the summer of 2016, I backpacked 450 miles through the Sierra Nevada mountain range alone. I carried ultralight provisions, a tent, freeze-dried food, a sleeping mat, baby wipes, and one change of underpants. So I had to find my water, filter it, and carry an extra 8 to 10 extra pounds of liquid on my back. And it's so mind-blowing how precious water becomes when you can no longer magically have it flow right out of a faucet. So the last stop on my journey was Mount Whitney. I backed the peak, rambled down the mountain, got in my car, and flipped on Democracy Now! Amy Goodman was reporting the dog attacks on unarmed water protectors at Standing Rock who were defending the Missouri River against the illegal construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. I knew right then and there that I had to go. I arrived in North Dakota on Indigenous Peoples Day. Colorful banners tacked on to a long barbed wire fence screamed, "Defend the sacred, Red Nation Rising." Free Palestine and no dapple. I entered Ocheti, or the camp of the seven sacred fires. Teepees were painted with animal icons, visions, and vibrant geometric colors. Bareback, shirtless, and bandana-clad riders galloped their horses across the plains. I was transported to another dimension some 200 years before. And this is really true. Tears actually rolled down my cheeks because I wondered, is this a dream? Am I in an altered state of consciousness? I didn't know. Drums pounded and men whooped across the three camps in the dead of night. In the morning, the sun lit up the high prairie grasses with 100 shades of purple, red, and gold. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged. So before the crack of dawn, an urgent call to action echoed out over a squeaky loudspeaker by Guide Dullknife of the Pine Ridge Reservation. "Wake up, my relatives," he shouted. "Greet the morning sun. We have come to protect the waters, so wake up. Get out of bed, relatives, and get going. After all, we're not on vacation here." On October 27th, the Morgan County Sheriff's Department and Tiger Swan, the private militia hired by the Mammoth Fossil Fuel Corporation Energy Transfer Partners, or ETP, raided the newly established North Treaty Camp that was dead in the path of the Black Snake. The camp was violently raided. Sound cannons burst our eardrums, tear gas filled our lungs. Elders in prayer were dragged out of the sweat lodge, thrown to their knees and handcuffed. The police slit our teepees and tents wide open, urinated and defecated on our survival provisions, and wantonly dumped our sacred relics, food and water, into the dirt. On November 20th, unarmed water protectors fired with water cannons and hit us with concussion grenades, rubber bullets, mace canisters, and lethal artillery on a bitterly cold 22-degree night at the backwater bridge. The militia hid behind full protective riot gear, while defenseless, peaceful warriors had little more than a prayer, a down jacket to safeguard them from the hail of weapons and chemical gases hurled our way. Over 150 protectors were seriously injured, and some 30 were sent to the hospital. Non-lethal weapons were illegally fired at near point-blank range and aimed at the knees, the head, and the eyes, blinding Susie in one eye and blowing the muscles off of Sophia's left arm. My lungs were seared, my stomach sick from drowning in the toxic gas I inhaled. People screamed and gagged for air between shouts of desperation. "Who needs a blanket? Who needs a mask? Medic! We need a medic right now!" Amidst the chaos, the cannon fire, and the psychological warfare raged against us 24/7, water protectors prayed. The mantra heard was, "It's a good day to die." On December 4th, 2016, 20,000 vets and water protectors showed up at Standing Rock and demanded Obama issue an order to deny Energy Transfer Partners the permit to construct the pipeline until an environmental impact report was conducted. ETP defied the order and paid a $50,000 fine instead. Construction continued, and so did the direct action, sometime in 0 to -20-degree snowstorms. The second executive order, signed by the newly inaugurated president, overturned Obama's decision to deny the permit. An eviction notice to eviscerate our three main camps followed. The assault would be executed at 2 p.m. on February 22nd, 2017. That day, we faced rocket launchers, fully automatic loaded weapons, in every federal law enforcement agency, including the Morton County Police Department, the FBI, the ATF, the National Guard, the National Park Police, and troopers from 6 different states, as well as the notorious private militia, Tiger Swan, who is owned by Eric Prince, and by the way, whose sister is Betsy DeVos. One Native American vet of the Iraqi War told me she was ordered to protect the base at El Toro, California, when the assault first began on Iraq in 2003. She said at no time was the protective detail and firepower at El Toro anywhere near as big as it was at Standing Rock. Many of our world possessions and cars were frozen into the ground and could not be removed. Our request to extend the deadline for the eviction was denied. The mission of the coming raid was to wipe out our existence as they had done so many times before in the last 500 years. I gotta tell you that adrenaline surged through our veins as the deadline approached. We were going to war, armed with nothing more than a prayer, a song, our iPhones, and our voices. Before the militarized troops eradicated our existence, we torched our own wooden homes and ceremonial hogans built to survive the Arctic winter. Smoke and flames billowed into the sky as we watched them burn to the ground. We held one last ceremony in camp before we marched out on our own terms. We smudged, prayed, cried, sang, and marched out of Ocheti for the last time. A ragtag collection of photojournalists outfitted in highly visible fluorescent green press vests walked back to the front lines with the remaining unarmed warriors. At 4 p.m., I was tackled and arrested at the North Gate along with 9 other water protectors. And the police officers kept yelling, "Stop resisting, stop resisting." And for those of you who don't know, photojournalists are a specially protected group under the Constitution's First Amendment. Journalists were targeted for arrest, our gear confiscated, and we were charged with obstructing a government event. So when people are shocked that journalists are being attacked at the George Floyd demonstrations, I can only laugh because this has been a long policy of our government to stifle the truth. I was handcuffed for 6 hours. The plastic cuffs were so tight they had to be cut off with wire cutters twice because my hands were turning blue. I was stripped down to leggings, socks, and a long sleeve t-shirt, thrown into a dog kennel and sat on an ice cold concrete floor with Arctic winds blowing into the detention cages. 2 officers failed to read me my Miranda rights before demanding to know where the weapons were hidden in the camp. All of my video and photographic evidence of their crimes were confiscated. I told the arresting officer they could not legally delete any material from my camera, and he smirked and said, "You're in North Dakota now, honey. We could do whatever we want." So we were transported to Devil's Lake Correctional Facility. I refused to answer questions that was my legal right to withhold. The prison guard slammed my file shut and scrawled "uncooperative" in great big letters across my file. She said, "Things are gonna be much tougher for you in here." I then asked permission to make one phone call, and she snipped, "I'm sorry, but criminals don't have rights here." And I told her, "But I'm not a criminal, and even if I were, I still have rights under the Constitution." She snapped back, "If you keep asking to make a phone call, you're never gonna get one." And I never did. So I was locked up with the res girls, and many of them had been in the slammer for a few weeks with no phone call privileges. Some of their families had no idea where they were. So I jotted down the numbers of their families on a page ripped out of the back of one of the Christian books of redemption with a worn down pencil. And when I got out, I called the families to inform them of where their relative was being held. Beds were in short supply that night. I reluctantly slept on the cold concrete floor in a plastic multi-purpose boat. In the morning, I could hear the prison guard's keys jangling as she walked down the hallway. When she came in, I asked her what that thing was that I slept in. And she laughed and she said, "Oh yeah, those boats? Oh, those are used to haul out dead bodies when someone dies on the block." A year or so later, my trial came up. My pro bono lawyer told me the court was offering to drop the charges if I didn't get arrested for the next 365 days. It was impossible for me to agree to those terms because I was going out to photograph the upcoming demonstrations in DC, upcoming demonstrations supporting women's rights, immigrants, and protection for the environment. So my lawyer got back to me and said, "Okay, the court will drop all the charges if you agree not to get arrested for the next 24 hours. I told her I either stand on the First Amendment or I don't. So tell the court I do not accept the terms. The charges were dropped, and a month later, Morton County appealed the decision to the Supreme Court of North Dakota and reinstated my charges. They lost their appeal, and my legal problems were over. So people ask me what happened to Standing Rock. And as Lula Red Cloud, the great-great-granddaughter of Chief Red Cloud, said, we were forced to accept the government's decision with a gun pointed to our heads. We would either leave camp or be murdered by the real terrorists, the government, unquote. The pipeline was constructed under the Missouri River. It is already spewing that black poison into Mother Earth's soil, as we predicted it surely would. Following the Wounded Knee Massacre on December 29th, 1890, both Black Elk and Crazy Horse had a vision. The Red Nation would rise up again and be a blessing to a sick world that is filled with broken promises. And Crazy Horse had another vision. He foresaw a new generation, the seventh generation of youth, who would bring balance and hope to the earth. He believed all races of mankind would gather together under the sacred tree of life, and the broken circle of the sacred hoop would become whole again. Native people now believe we are witnessing the rise of the seventh generation. Autumn Peltier, Greta Thunberg, and people of every race and age from all over the world are rising up under the banners of no justice, no peace, and I can't breathe. We left our sacred tribal lands, but we were not defeated. We came to Standing Rock in love and prayer. We came to cut off the head of the black snake. And oftentimes, I think back to the last march out of Standing Rock, and I say to myself, it's a good day to die, but we are still here. Black lives matter, and please remember that Native lives matter too. That's it.
Thank you, Tonita.
Thank you.
Give it up for Tonita. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Oh, marvelous. It's a lot to take in, and I really appreciate and am humbled and inspired by, as I often am when I hear you talk, Tonita, with your vulnerability as well as your courage. So thank you for sharing all of that with us.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah. So what we're going to do right now is the four of us, myself and Anna and Darius and Tonita, we're just going to talk a little bit, and then pretty soon we'll open it up for general questions and discussion amongst you. So if you have questions, start thinking about them. I guess, Anna, do you have a question burning in you to begin us?
It was so hard to think of questions during that because I was so immersed in the story of it. And I just want to say thank you for fighting all these fights on behalf of all of us and the earth and future generations.
My duty. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
I guess I have a question for you, Tonita, and I have questions for you too, Darius, don't worry. But I guess my question is a very, maybe an impossible one to answer, which is where the source of your courage is. As in, to walk on the front lines, to say it is a good day to die, and still to take that next step is unfathomable to me and is, I think, astounding. And I wonder if you can talk about what the internal experience is of that at all.
I mean, sure, we're all scared. I think it's like any soldier who's on the battlefield. But when you believe in something so deeply and you know that your ancestors have been fighting for recognition, for land acknowledgement, for basic, most of the reservations live in a food desert. We're fighting for healthcare. If you take the Navajo Nation, for example, they applied to the government for protective gear, and Trump sent them body bags instead. So we're always fighting. And it was such an incredible experience to be there and to feel that I belonged for the first time in my life. And to know that what they were fighting for is not just for Native American people in Standing Rock, but all the people who are down the Missouri River, all 18 million people, for the farmers, the people living in the cities, to fight for your basic right to clean water and to be punished for that. If we don't stand up, then our children and our grandchildren, well, as we said always when we were at Standing Rock, that someday the people in power will find out that you can't drink oil and you can't eat money. So.
And I guess what that makes me think, Tonita, is like everything you're saying, it's one thing to know that and to know it up here as an intellectual truth. And it's a wholly other thing to embody it. And I think, I wonder to what extent the tools of culture, of ritual, of art, of language, of gathering, the way that those tools make that connection from here to here.
Yeah, I mean, art is the awakening. It's the thing that opens people's eyes, whether it's a book or it's music or it's a painting or something like that. I mean, I guess from a young age, because I always felt really different, I was a big reader and I read all the time. And so I was reading all of the books about the Black experience in the 60s, and then also feeling very isolated, like I was the only person of color in Orange County at this area at the time. And also having been an athlete, you know, every day you go out and you have to prove yourself and you put in the time and you discipline yourself and you suffer through the aches and pains and the disappointments and the downs. You know, when you're not doing well, you have to find a way to keep going. I mean, I had this goal for 8 years to make the Olympic team, and that's what I thought about. And so that's what I wanted. And then of course, when I got to Mexico, the whole experience, it was very bittersweet, just going there with kind of this bright-eyed idea of what the Olympics were going to be about, and finding out that a lot of people didn't see things the way I thought they would be. So it really turned me into an activist at that time. And, you know, to this day, Tommy Smith and John Carlos are heroes to me, and they were at that time as well. I knew that they were right because I'd been reading all these books. So it would be much more painful for me to sit at home and do nothing. You know, the anxiety of that would be too much. So where does it come from? I don't know. Maybe you're just born with it. I don't know. Not sure. Yeah.
That was beautiful. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I see a comment. Okay, we'll come back to that. I actually have a question for both of you about journalism. I think I was really moved in the Black Lives Matter protests a few weeks ago also at how there was complete disregard for folks in press uniforms and press badges, and hearing this again, the way you were treated despite having this identification. And I wonder if, for both of you, how you think that kind of blatant disregard has changed the way that people conduct journalism, for like whether it has made it more conservative or has made folks lean more into activism, or what your guys' feelings on that is.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in here. It's an interesting question, and I think a lot about sort of what this seemingly like never-ending moment of chaos is doing for like the profession of journalism, which is something that I sort of love very just selfishly because I think it's very fun, but obviously I also think is important to have, for a society. But I'm a little bit dismayed to see, just from anecdotally looking around the industry, that the chaos has sort of pushed a lot of people in positions of power within journalism to retreat to some kind of idea of objectivity or of being able to not have to wade through the world or not have to, the idea that we can be perfectly unbiased. And I think that some journalism organizations are doing a great job, and I give a lot of credit to NPR, where I work, for trying to reckon with all of these questions. But I think generally there are a lot of precepts of journalism that could do with some questioning in terms of, where do we draw our authority from when deciding how to talk about people or movements or events? What authority are we appealing to? And sort of how set in stone are ideas about what role a journalist should play. I think the other thing that I would say that's been really hard to watch is when President Trump was initially running for office and then elected, there was a sense in journalism, again, just anecdotally, that this is going to be great for us because people are going to care about news again. And we saw this huge spike in newspaper subscriptions, and we saw people donating to organizations like ProPublica. And there was this sense, I heard people in positions of power in my world, my peers, say oh, this is going to be wonderful for us. But I think that we sort of bit into a poisoned apple on that one, in the sense that by buying into and benefiting from the chaos, we're now just sort of mired in it. And it's, there was so much said about, oh, we're not going to cover what the president says, we're going to cover what he does, and we're going to cover policy, and we're going to do all this. But it's almost like we've gone on this carousel of chaos that I don't know how we get off of, and how we not careen from crisis to crisis in the reporting, and reinforce crisis narratives in a way that's irresponsible. So I don't know. I don't know the answer to any of those questions.
Well, can I add to that? Is that all right? Yeah. So Standing Rock was a really unique situation because mainstream media, for the most part, wasn't there. Mm-hmm. And the technology of the powers that be, so to speak, people on the other side, our adversaries, they had sophisticated military equipment. So it was a bunch of freelance ragtag photojournalists and we didn't have internet, by the way, in the camps. We didn't have running water, we didn't have electricity. And we got internet, I think, around sometime in November. So we would have to go to the casino to download all our stuff, to get our pictures out, to get our stuff out. But the other thing is most of us were doing live feeds on Facebook. And normally we did that when there was a direct action, which they were quite regular. And they had stingrays, and they were zapping our phones. So you'd be right in the middle of filming something and your phone would get zapped. So, these things that we were trying to negotiate, and hopefully there were enough people had their phones going that they didn't have enough beams to, basically disable all of us. But the iPhone was this incredible tool to get the word out. And because there wasn't mainstream media on the ground, there was us, the boots on the ground, that got the word out to the rest of the world. And it's so incredible that people in Europe, South America, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Africa, knew more what was going on at Standing Rock than people in this country did. And people came from all over the world. A lot of indigenous tribes, the Mayans came, the Aztecs came, the Maoris came, a tribe from Africa. They all came to present ceremony with us, to dance. And the Maoris were great. You know, they were doing their haka thing against the guys on the other side of the backwater bridge. So these iPhones were like amazing. If it hadn't been for the iPhones and live feed on Facebook for all of Facebook's faults, I don't know if this would have become as big a thing as it did, because we had donations coming in from all over the world. I mean, clothes, and we had a gymnasium full of clothes and food, and trucks were dropping off stuff, and trucks were coming in with loads of logs and for heating, and donations were coming in from everywhere. And it was from, so everybody was a little bit of a photojournalist here. And I think that now in this culture, like that young woman, I mean, nobody talks about her, but I have to call her out, Darnella Frazier, who shot that video of George Floyd, 17 years old. She kept filming, she shot, she didn't stop. I mean, man, incredible. Nobody ever mentions her name, Darnella Frazier. Man, she's an incredible young lady. And it's people like her who have the courage to keep filming in the face of, you know, oppression from the police.
I want to hazard a question to try to braid these two talks a little bit together, which I think are definitely talking to each other. Just
yeah, I was thinking about his stuff. Yeah, definitely.
And I guess like what I'm thinking about right now, listening to you talk, Tonita, is about the commoditization of things that perhaps should not be commoditized. For instance, water. For instance, turning land into natural resources, right? Which is what DAPL is all about. And I guess I'm thinking about this in terms of Darius, at least as I understood what you were talking about, and correct me to the extent that I'm wrong, because I'm notoriously stupid about economics. The way at least I'm understanding what you're talking about markets as essentially a tool for distribution. And the example you gave with the pickle problem is like, okay, if we set up a market, that is sort of a game that can play out that ends up kind of maximizing the distribution of these things to solve this problem. And so it's a tool that solves particular kinds of problems, which is framing it as something that is morally neutral, which is also what I sort of understand from your overall presentation. Is like a market or finance itself is morally neutral. It's how it's used. It's how much power it gets. That's the problem. And I guess, you know, first of all, my first question is like, is that a correct assessment of what you're talking about? And if so, I guess my question is, are there any things to which applying market as a tool is not morally neutral to? Are there any things that cannot, should not be placed in using market as a technology?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think that is, I guess that is sort of what I was saying. I guess, I don't know if I would say markets are morally neutral. I almost think of them, I mean, the word market is such a broad word that encompasses so many phenomena that I almost think of it like a fungus, in the sense that it's sort of a thing that naturally occurs, and depending on what kind of conditions you set, it will occur in different ways, and it can be harmful and it can be useful. You just have to sort of be careful about what kind of fungus you're fostering. But I definitely think that there are areas of society that should not be subjected to markets. I mean, healthcare is one that comes to mind, right? I mean, we've seen what havoc that can reap. And I think this gets at a deeper problem. You know, Benjamin Applebaum has a great book called The Economist's Hour that is all about how economists came to dominate public policy. And a lot of economists have this problem of sort of selective ignorance or convenient ignorance, where when they talk about markets in an idealized sense, they talk about a economics 101 idea of markets, you know, where humans are perfectly rational and they have all the available information and there are no transaction costs and everything runs smoothly. But, you know, these are all people with economics PhDs, which means they also took economics 201, where you learn about market failures and you learn about, hey, maybe markets aren't going to function because there's a asymmetry of information, or maybe because there's coercion involved, or maybe because people aren't acting rationally because of prejudice or fear, or, so it's sort of funny going to like economics conferences and watching people get heated about, no, markets are the best way to set salaries, and it's because they're perfectly efficient. And it's like, that's not true. You're like choosing to have an unnuanced view of this. So I think the biggest thing for me is that you cannot rely on a market to tell you what is valuable. And I use that in like a sense of like values, like what is valuable for society? What kind of world do we want to be? Do we want to be a world where we use every single ounce of productive capability we have to create as big a surplus as possible, which is the current imperative of our system? Or do we want to be a world where we step away from having that much surplus, where maybe we have flat GDP growth, where maybe companies don't have to have exponentially growing profits? Like, that's a question that no market can tell you the answer to. It's something that, we have to find a way to settle upon as a society. And so yeah, I think that like definitely in realms that where it affects people's survival, in the cases of like food or healthcare or water, for example, I think are areas where you can do without markets in a lot of cases. And, I think in the big questions. Oh, I don't know.
So I just have a comment about what you just said. 60 to 70%, I believe, and I'd have to check that, of the natural resources of this country are lying under Native American land on the reservations, and land that's been stolen. Like the area where we were, all the camps, we were on what we call treaty land, which is land that was deeded and given, that's such a horrible word, negotiated with the Standing Rock tribes, and there's 6 or 7 or 8 tribes within that tribe. And the government illegally sold it to ranchers, farmers, and miners. So we were on what was legally ours, but it was illegally sold. And of course, the government and the ETP was claiming eminent domain, and in any case, when you have a market of commodities like gold, uranium, platinum, and you're destroying the land and the life and the culture of indigenous people so that the market can stay healthy and people can get their stock dividends every 3 months. That's a really hard thing for me to swallow, because what they're leaving behind is contamination of the basic right of all life, which is water. And there has to be some way that the markets can find growth without poisoning the planet, without poisoning cultures, without cutting down the rainforest so people can eat hamburgers. And because we have to, I think, look at what's our survival worth. So what are we going to do to change that? And, the Amazon's still on fire. So how do we change people's minds to change their lifestyle, to, slow down eating meat, to not need all this stuff that we think we need, and still be able to maintain some kind of economic balance? Because if we don't have environmental balance, we're just not going to make it.
That's, I think, so interesting. And I love that you phrased it as, can the markets maintain growth while also, taking into account the health of the planet? And I think that's so interesting, because so built into our idea of what an economic system should be is that growth should be a goal. And there's some really great economists who question that. Like, do we need growth? Like, maybe we need some period without growth. Maybe we need to stop thinking about how we can just grow the economy at all costs. There's a really wonderful economist named Kate Raworth who has a book called Donut Economics. And she basically says the dominant picture in economics that governs everything is an exponential curve that goes up forever and ever, and is getting faster and faster with each passing year. But she proposes an alternate picture of a donut, where if your growth is inside the donut, you're not providing enough for the well-being of your citizens, you're not improving quality of life. If the growth is outside of the donut, you're overtaxing your planet, it's unsustainable, you don't have the resources to continue. And so if we could replace this picture of a curve that goes up forever with a picture of some system that is where staying within your means is built into it, like maybe we can reconceptualize this idea, and you could have flat GDP growth and it wouldn't be, a disaster for society. People wouldn't lose their minds. So I agree with you 100% that like, I think so many of our inherent assumptions are just incompatible with coexisting with our planet.
That is super fascinating. Just because I want to be wary of time, I thought I would offer it up to the rest of the group to see if anyone else had a question for either speaker. And if you want to speak, you can raise your hand or you can write in the chat, and then we can go from there. And you can unmute yourself too. Diana, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much, both of you. I guess I don't have exactly a question. It's just listening to both of you. Some images and thoughts came to mind that I just wanted to put out there for the group to consider. And this idea of society versus economy. And so often the people who are pushing the market are talking about, we've got to, save the economy, but an economy doesn't have in its balance sheet the humans and the earth. And a society actually is a more holistic view of culture and health and well-being of the whole. And it's also this taking the word growth away from what true beauty and growth is of a garden and even in a garden there's death and there's downtime and there is this cycle of building and rebuilding and rebirth, and which is society too. So anyway, those are just images and thoughts that you both sort of brought up for me that I wanted to pass back to the group. Thanks, I'll pass.
I loved that. Thank you, Diana. Yeah, like what is growth? We should imagine that.
There's a big movement amongst, in certain areas of like the economics profession to find ways to value like care work better, the type of work that needs to be done to make and raise and nurture humans, which doesn't get counted at all, and yet is completely crucial to everything else functioning. So I don't know, I don't have an answer for that, but yeah, there's people who are trying to find a way to value that stuff more concretely.
I see that Brendan has his hand raised. Or
yeah, hi. Now I have to unraise it. You do that. Oh, it went unraised. Okay. Thank you to both Tonita and Darius for your fascinating talks. I wanted to also offer a kind of comment that is a different way I saw these two talks kind of tying together with each other. So Darrius started out by talking about the kind of conflict between his lefty friends and his more capitalist-friendly coworkers, and thinking of the general argument about like what kind of system should we have, what kind of economic or political system should we have. I think those arguments are often couched in terms of like what should the ideal principles be, what should be encoded in our constitution or our laws. And something that I think Tonita's experience really brings out, and something that I feel like I've learned more and more as I kind of learn more about the injustices that really happen on the ground, is that often the problem is not even just what system should we have in principle, but that on the ground enforcement, we're not living up to the system that we currently have, that we're not respecting the property rights that we claim to respect in capitalism, that we're not respecting the constitutional rights that are already enshrined in our political system. And I feel like it's a common kind of conservative critique of, leftish activists that they defend the system. They defend the system in principle. They point to the value of capitalism or markets in principle. And I think that you can defend that when you are in a position where the system works the way it's supposed to work for you. So, if you are a rich white person, then capitalism works roughly the way it's supposed to in principle for you. And if you then, often I think these people just don't even realize that there are many people for whom the system isn't even live up to in its very basic ideals. So, Tonita's point about there's an irony that the Standing Rock protesters were being charged as criminals for kind of violating the property rights of the oil company, when in fact they were on land that was stolen, violating the rights of the Native Americans before that. And even in the process of enforcing, the police were violating your bodily rights and also your property rights, messing with your iPhones. And so I just thought one kind of intersection here was that sometimes I think the debate maybe isn't even about what system we should have in principle, which, is a good and important question to have. And there might be problems even with the letter of the law, but even just with how it's enforced and how it's kind of made real on the ground, and how a lot of oppression takes the form of not living up to even what we have written in the letter of the law.
So this is what I think, that people at the top think that they really believe that their money's going to protect them, that they live so high on top of the mountain in this big divine bubble. They think that the decisions that they make will not affect them. Because if they did, they'd be doing something more about it than trying to get as much as they can. I mean, how much money does Jeff Bezos need to be happy? How much money does he have to make? He makes enough in 1 hour to pay for those 3,000 people who lost their health care under him. In an hour, he makes enough money to spend $1 million a day, every day for the next 400 years. Now, is that extra 60 billion he and Mark Zuckerberg made over the pandemic going to make them happier? I mean, this is what I don't understand, is that we are headed in such the wrong direction that I don't know what it's going to take for people to understand that when you go to a national park, take out your trash, leave no trace behind. We go there because it's pristine. We go there because it's beautiful and it's clean and it feels like it was, 200 or 300 years ago. And yet people still leave their trash behind. What is it going to take to change people's mind about how they are in the world so that our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren can survive? Every decision we make today, every single one, what we eat, what we buy, where we go, how we get from one place to another, all of that. And that's the thing about the seventh generation, the whole concept of the seventh generation. It's when you make a decision, you're not thinking how it's going to affect, the quarterly returns or this year or tomorrow or next week. You're thinking about how it's going to affect the next 7 generations from now. Those are the decisions, how we're making a decision. And that's why in Native American culture, we believe that the 7th generation is here now, that the protests that are happening with George Floyd, that the environmental things that are happening, that what happened at Standing Rock, these are all moving in the right direction. But we got to get on the bus, man. We all have to get on the bus and look at our life and find out, are you buying from Amazon? I don't use Amazon. I don't buy from Whole Foods anymore. It's like I'm just checking them off right and left. What am I no longer going to support? Because I don't want to put another nickel in Jeff Bezos' pocket. So, the convenience of things, I think we have to really look at versus the long-term survival and sustainability of the planet. Sorry, I get emotional about this stuff, but you know.
Oh, thank you so much. We have one more person. We have a raised hand, and I think we don't have maybe more time for after this one. Let's gauge it. But Elena, your hand was raised. Would you like to ask a question or a comment?
Yeah. Oh, can you guys hear me?
Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Okay. My headphones are weird. Thank you both. That was amazing. I'm just wow, there's so much. But my question is really actually was prompted by Darius's talk, but is oriented more towards Tonita, which is that Darius spoke about just like financing predating capitalism, and that finance is not necessary and banking aren't necessarily evils but tools. And I was struck. I recently learned about an artist collective in Milan that has developed their own currency so that they can operate sort of outside of the normative euro, like in Italy. And it's called Common Coin. And they have created a universal basic income for all of their members. And basically I read this and I was like, this is amazing, because I had read otherwise somewhat, like cynical perspectives on Bitcoin, and like basically reading about this felt like a really powerful way to utilize currency. And that had me thinking, now I'm really curious, Tonita, what alternative currencies were taking place at Standing Rock? Like I'm just like inspired to hear how people, like what became valuable, what was being traded, what was being bartered. Like, I'm just curious.
Got it. It was such Standing Rock. There was nothing to buy. Nobody had to spend any money. We were really depending upon the kindness of strangers and people who cared. People were donating rooms at the casino so we could take a shower, or somebody would get a room and then they'd invite all their friends to come and take a shower. I mean, I got a couple of rooms, and there were so many people taking showers and stuff like that. People were donating wood, food. I don't know where it came from, but it was coming from all over, and there was always food. There were about 18 kitchens on Ocheti camp alone. So there were 3 main camps. There was Sacred Stone, Rosebud, and Ocheti, which is the 7 Sacred Fires camp. That was the biggest one, where most of the native people were. And inside each of the camps were like numerous camps, from the Cheyenne to the Arapaho to Iroquois, the Red Warriors, and all. I was in Cali camp, and I don't know where the food came from, but it showed up, and we never went without food. People were donating wood, and there were people chopping wood. We built an entire community in like 7 or 8 months, from one person on April 1st, 2016. By the time December 4th rolled around in 2016, there were 20,000 people there. And people were always bringing provisions for the rest of us. It was really miraculous. I don't know who organized it. I don't know how it got there or who brought it, but man, there was never a shortage of food. And it was kind of a miraculous in so many ways. And there was a friend of mine who had a big water truck. It was called the Love Water. And he'd fill his tanks up, and he'd come around and, give people water, and that was free. He got donations. Certain people, I was getting some donations to help me stay there so I could cover it. But people were just sharing. And there was a construction crew, and a lot of the materials were donated. When things got really heavy after November 20th, Ace Hardware and some of the hardware stores in Bismarck refused to sell any more of the propane heaters. and because they knew they were all going down to Standing Rock. People from all over the world, we put that information out, and people from all over the world were calling and emailing the executive offices of Ace Hardware, and in 2 days, they were selling those things to us again. I mean, it was cooperation, love, so much love there. And don't get me wrong, you know, there was a lot of political stuff that, you know, if you don't get involved, because it's a generational thing, but so much generosity and so much love. It was really an extraordinary experience. Just amazing. Yeah.
Wow, alternative economies like that really make my blood boil in a good way.
Yeah.
Makes me so excited.
It
And
was
I think
incredible.
it's so, I think when I think about what I was doing during Standing Rock, like the primary way I was involved was through a divestment campaign, trying to get folks to divest from banks that were
Wells Fargo, Chase.
Yeah, and finding alternative banking options for folks. That was something I was really invested in during Standing Rock. And I think that connection is so fascinating.
And it's hugely successful because $3.5 trillion has been divested from the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah,
That's a huge, huge success. I mean, it's just massive. Yeah.
I think that is all we have time for today, unless someone has a super burning question or comment that I don't want to suppress.
I do have one question.
Okay. Yes.
For Darius.
Yes.
Define civilization, because you kept using that word. And I really wonder what your concept is of civilization.
Yes, that is, it's a little loose language. I should have tightened up. Good note. I guess when I say civilization, I'm just talking about the sort of demarcation, the Neolithic revolution in about 10,000 years ago, when we went from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies, and then started developing cities. Like basically, I guess cities would be the defining characteristic. And yeah, like maybe civilization is loaded language. Like maybe that's not the way to talk about it. And like maybe the better way to talk about it would be like densely populated, agrarian, financialized, groups of people. I don't know. Maybe developing interest rates was our first mistake. I don't know.
Yeah, only because, our concept of civilization is very different. Mm-hmm. Very, very different. And we've been told, since the beginning that we're savages and pagans, but who's the real savage? And I'll leave that with you. My closing statement.
On that, I want to offer Tonita and Darius, if there are any, if you'd like to make any plugs at this point, either for people whose work that's exciting you, organizations that are exciting you, anything like that. If you can think of it now, that's great. Otherwise, we can always email things out later.
Yeah, one thing I need to give credit to, a book that informed a lot of my talk that is one of my favorite books. It's called Money Changes Everything by a historian named William Getzman. He does a much better job of explaining a lot of this stuff. So definitely recommend that.
Yeah, I would say Tommy Orange's book, There. If you haven't read it, I see a lot of people shaking their head, right? Yeah, friggin' killer, man. Orange, There by Tommy Orange.
Great, thank you. That's been on my reading list for a while, so
yeah, killer.
It'll now go closer to the top. Thanks, Tonita. Anyway, I want to thank you all for hanging out with us tonight. Big thanks to Tonita and Darius. Let's give them another little round of finger applause here. And thank you to all of you for doing this. This was really a wonderful evening.
Well, thank you to Anna and Jerry for organizing.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry and Anna. Thank you so much. We got to get McDowell to dial into this. It's really a great idea. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
Cool.
Thank you guys. And I actually wanted to do one plug, thinking about alternative economies and collective care. I wanted to put a donate link for the mutual aid that I work with in Kensington, Windsor Terrace, but is also taking on a lot of aid and need from across Brooklyn. So yay to mutual aid and alternative economies. And thank you guys all so much for coming. It was so nice to see so many familiar faces, expected and unexpected, and all these thoughtful comments vocalized and in the chat.
Thank
Agreed.
you.
And I'll say,
Thanks, everybody.
mark your calendars. We're going to do the next one in 2 weeks, Wednesday, July 8th. We'll figure out who the speakers are, or talkers, rather. And if you would like to be that talker, let us know. You've got our email addresses. You know, this is an open door.
Cool. This is really fun. Thanks a lot, you guys.
Well, thank you again, Tonita. Hope you all can join us again.
Yep.
Thank you guys. So brilliant, everyone.
Thank you. So now what do I do?
You can press the leave button. It's red.
Oh, okay. Jerry, don't go away.
For yourself.
I'll be here.
Okay.